So just a few last words, really on moving to implementation. So the photo here is intended to represent the sort of long road ahead that lies once you've so if you've concluded a BLA or an MOU, congratulations. That's already quite a piece of work that can involve, in many cases, several years of negotiation and discussion. So that's already something, but there is, of course, the next part is the actual implementation. So a few points to keep in mind when we consider implementation of these agreements. The first is that most BLAs and MOUs offer quite a general framework. What's needed now are specific concrete measures to translate those measures into concrete, improved job opportunities, better working conditions. So it's not just by signing an agreement that we can ensure better conditions. So I just think of if we can give a very practical example. So we mentioned earlier that among the good practice provisions that you'd have in the model agreement would be to ensure that migrant workers have access to justice or dispute mechanisms. So again, in practice, this means that the countries of origin and destination have to think about how to make this happen, how to make a free or affordable legal representation, how to make interpretation or translation services. Is there a need for alternative housing? Perhaps the migrant worker was housed by the employer and in the case of a dispute can no longer remain housed by that employer. So there's a whole host of things that go behind a principle like access to dispute resolution mechanisms that need to be thought through. It doesn't mean that the governments need to themselves be the implementer of all of these aspects, but it is important to ensure. That's why consultation with other stakeholders like trade unions, like employers organizations, like civil society organizations, to see what kind of services can be put in place to make these clauses really happen is really something very important to think about. The other reason beyond that sort of moving from the general to the more concrete, the reason that obviously implementation is very important and monitoring is because there's BLAs don't operate obviously in a vacuum. They operate in a sort of economic and political context that is often, quite changing. So these influence basically the priorities of each country. They influence, they create new challenges, but also opportunities. So for instance, the job market of a country of destination can change radically from the start of a BLA negotiation to its finalization to a few years down the road. So is the job market, is there the same type of labor demand? Have the sectors that are in need evolved? Has there been an economic recession? We can think, of course, of the obvious case of COVID-19, when obviously very big changes. So to what extent is the BLA relevant? And to make sure that it's relevant, there really needs to be a regular system to monitor the agreements and adjust them. And finally, a third thing to keep in mind when we think about implementation is that political will matters quite a lot when it comes to making BLAs and MOUs a reality. They often require quite sustained technical, financial, and human resources. And they also require quite a bit of coordination. So within and across ministries, so I mentioned that sometimes between a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a Ministry of Labor, you can have quite different visions for what are the priorities within a BLA or MOU negotiation. Across countries, obviously, priorities can be different. So really, monitoring and keeping in mind that agreements, required a sustained political will and the sort of resources that go with it is really essential to making BLAs sort of a reality. What often happens, frequently too often, is that an agreement is signed and then left as it is. So it really doesn't have much of an impact, unfortunately, on migrant workers themselves. So when we look again, we're looking now, at the practice of BLAs. BLAs, some of the limitations that we found in ILO research. So we've mentioned that some of the rights issues are not addressed within the text of agreement, which leaves little hope for them being implemented in practice. I mentioned the issue of resources. Are there resources dedicated to implementation and follow-up? Is there a budget for those? Are consular, services prepared to do follow-up, etc. Very often, unfortunately, there's no systematic mechanism to review agreements or to evaluate them. They're often automatically renewed after a certain number of years without any thought given to how can we improve or adjust the agreement. Unfortunately, there's weak enforcement of standard employment contracts. So I mentioned this good practice of annexing employment contracts, but of course that needs to go with enforcement, notably by ministries of labor. Can be through labor inspection, can be also through consular services. We've also seen, unfortunately, that while sort of in theory, BLAs and MOUs can be a way to promote key rights embodied in international conventions like equality of treatment, unfortunately, what can end up happen is that they actually reinforce discrimination between national and foreign workers. We can think specifically of the issue of wages. So unfortunately, in some cases, negotiations over BLAs, MOUs come down to the issue of, a country of destination offering one wage level for a country of origin and then offering another wage level for a different based on, not based on any sort of objective criteria. So you actually have BLAs, MOUs, which can lead to discriminatory practices. And then, as we've mentioned a little bit earlier, is this lack of transparency or communication. Again, it's no use in outlining the specific regulations on recruitment or the rights of migrant workers if neither recruitment agencies or migrant workers or employers are made aware of the contents of agreements. There's, again, very little likelihood that they'll be applied if nobody knows about them. And so if we think about why do we have some of these barriers, some of the underlying causes? Well, the first is probably the unfortunate reality that there is often unequal bargaining power between a country of origin and destination. Unfortunately, countries of destination, have their fair, pick of countries of origin from which to source their labor. And so countries of origin may not be willing to bring some of the difficult rights issues to the table for fear of losing access to a labor market. So that's one sort of structural issue. The other I've mentioned already several times, the lack of coordination and divergent priorities. The issue of incoherent policies, that BLAs may be pursued without thinking about how they align, for instance, with national, of course, migration policies, but also policies on skills development, education and training, employment policies. So ensuring that, for instance, migrant, workers with profiles that are needed in the country are not being systematically, sent off to other countries, vice versa, that kind of thing. Lack of consultation, I've mentioned. Lack of data. It's very difficult to if we don't have sort of baseline data on existing migration flows and dynamics, it's very difficult to really assess the impact of a BLA if we don't have a before picture. And if we don't have means to sort of continuously track that kind of data, it's very difficult to see what kind of impact we're having. Political will, I've mentioned. Gaps in labor inspection and labor laws. It is important to remember that, BLAs and MOUs do not replace the need for robust labor laws and mechanisms for controlling labor conditions. It's really only a BLA is really only good as the labor law that backs it up. So again, as we saw in the example, sometimes BLAs or MOUs make mention of that the agreement will be implemented in accordance with national labor laws, but it's very important to check what those labor laws say. I can think of a very specific example. For instance, in a lot of the Arab states, labor laws do not cover certain sectors of workers, particularly domestic workers, and in some cases, agricultural workers. So saying that the migrant workers will be covered by national labor laws actually means nothing because labor laws don't apply. So it's really important to look into, what do the labor laws say. And then finally, unfortunately, BLAs should come with tangible changes in migration or recruitment. So ensuring that there are tangible changes to policies. If there's already weak recruitment oversight, and the BLAs make mention of strengthening that, but no actual changes are made, again, it's going to stay just letters on a page. So after that slightly negative outlook, maybe just to give a few sort of tips that the ILO gives or advice on how to make sure that BLAs are more really serve to promote the rights of migrant workers. So we've mentioned again this issue of transparency, wide dissemination. I believe it's the Philippines. I think our participant from the Philippines could possibly confirm, but which has the practice of posting the texts of BLAs and MOUs on its government websites and making them widely available. And I think that's already very important to make sure that the texts are actually available to those who will be most needing them. Ensuring inclusive processes. So this is from the development phase to the negotiation, implementation, monitoring, ensuring that employers and workers organizations, as well as civil society organizations that work very closely with migrant workers, are on board and have their word to say. Ensuring clear demarcation of responsibilities between countries of origin and destination, who is responsible for what and how. We mentioned the joint committees, ensuring consistency of agreements with international standards, reinforcing complementary monitoring. So we talked about joint committees as a way of doing, obviously, joint monitoring between both countries, but particularly for countries of origin, it can be really important to invest in their own monitoring, notably through ensuring consular support. So, for instance, having labor attachés in the relevant embassies, a diplomatic representation. Somebody from that country to which migrant workers or their representatives can turn to in case of problems. And then again, this issue of ensuring that national labor migration policies are there and set out the broad objectives that BLAs should be feeding into. Very important. And then finally, the sort of open question that I mentioned earlier about lessons from COVID-19, how to look at things like what to do in the case of a crisis, ensuring that return and reintegration issues are included, some of those issues which have been neglected so far. So I will more or less stop there. I just have on this last slide a few examples of BLMA research guidance and tools from the ILO, and the ILO is participating in with other multilateral agencies. So I would just maybe mention that there is common UN system-wide guidance on BLMAs, which will be coming out this year, which is through the UN Network on Migration. There's a technical working group that involves some 20 UN agencies, civil society organizations, trade unions, employers' representatives, which are coming up with common guidance. So that will be something that basically lays out the basic principles, as well as guidance for each step of the BLA process. Maybe also just so Miriam mentioned the e-learning toolkit that was developed by ILO with IOM and the IDC, which is online, and I think you have the link to. Also, just to mention that under the SAMM project, my colleague Gloria they're developing some thematic briefs, and one of them will be on BLA. So I think she will speak to you about that. And then on the national level, we have several sort of specific tailored trainings and advice, just for you to know if your country is developing a BLA or an MOU and would like to share a draft with the ILO, that is possible, and we will provide a technical note of comments. As we won't provide track changes, but we will provide a note of comments that will allow you to, in the idea of improving the BLA text to ensure alignment with international instruments. So if you're embarking on that or have a draft, don't hesitate to reach out to the ILO office in your country or sub-region, and that will reach the office in Geneva. So thank you. I've talked a lot. I wasn't really able to follow the chat, but maybe I can look. I don't know, Miriam, how are we doing on time?
I think we still have a couple of minutes to basically, I have been monitoring the chat and grouping the questions here. So I think probably we have a few minutes also if other participants, they would like to add any other questions. But basically, We have a couple of technical questions and one kind of broad issue to address. So maybe my suggestion is that we start with the technical questions. That probably they are short, so. The first one was related to the Global Migration Compact that was, in this particular case, where it fits. Is it as a protocol, as a bilateral agreement, as a MOU, or what would be the classification for this specific case? Another technical question also has to do with the union-to-union arrangements related to migrant workers. Also, one participant asked if you could somehow to talk a little bit about that. And a couple of participants also, they asked for models of bilateral agreements, also if they could be made available for as a reference. So this is somehow covers the more precise technical questions. So should we start with them?
Sure, thanks. Thanks a lot for those questions, really good, tough questions. On the Global Compact of Migration, so if I understand the question is whether that is considered a multilateral agreement, I think it was the question. So the Global Compact is a different sort of agreement. It wouldn't fall under a multilateral. It's a multilateral agreement, but it wouldn't fall under the. It's not a labor agreement as such. The Global Compact is really more a sort of. It's a high level, a sort of a political level commitment to improving the conditions of migration. So ILO was very much involved in developing some of the text that is included in the Global Compact around decent work and around BLAs. And as I mentioned in one of my slides, around ensuring that the mention of, that it encourages states to enter into rights-based BLAs. So that's sort of where, ILO definitely put their 2 cents in there to ensure that the BLAs are aligned with international labor standards and are based on broad-based consultations. But the Global Compact, I would say, has more of a political weight than it's not an international treaty in the way that BLAs or some multilateral labor agreements could be. On the question of model agreements, again, I would recommend that you have a look at the annex to recommendation 86, which I can add the link here. Again, it's from 1949, but really out of the 29 different clauses, you have at least 20 something that are still completely relevant today. So I think that's a very good starting point. There's also one agreement that comes to mind that's considered generally quite a good practice, is between Nepal and Jordan. Has quite a number of good rights clauses. I mentioned also Philippines and Saudi Arabia on domestic workers has quite a few good clauses. So some of these can be found online, and I will put the link to, so the ILO, as part of the review that we did in 2014, 2015 of 130 some BLAs, created a sort of repertory of those BLAs, so they are accessible on the website, so you can access quite a few. Unfortunately, there are not that many agreements that I would say that are from start to finish absolute perfect examples of of rights-based agreements. Often they contain, some good clauses, some maybe less good. You have to remember that these are negotiated agreements, right? Countries of origin and destination have, to some extent, diverging priorities. So it's very difficult to say this agreement is really ideal. But I can put for you the link to that, the repository of BLAs for you here. And the other thing I would also encourage you, when you look in the toolkit on BLAs, that we mentioned, the online toolkit, you have clauses for each of the key areas. So we mentioned, supervision of living and working conditions. You have, wage protection. So you click and you have a kind of an ideal text of what could be included. And most of those are taken from different BLAs. So that's worth having a look at. In terms of union-to-union agreements, Basically, I think you have an example, but I could be wrong. I'm not super familiar with them, but I know that has been discussion between agreements, unions between Madagascar and Lebanon recently to look at migrant workers, domestic workers' rights. But I will have a look and see if we have examples, and I can maybe post that on the, I think you have a platform, and get back to you on some examples of union-to-union agreements. You also have in French, it's called the RSMMS, which is the network of trade unions for the Mediterranean, which have an agreement that covers several countries on both sides of the Mediterranean, and so North Africa, Western Europe, and also West Africa. And that network has done a lot of cooperation, sort of strengthening trade unions' capacity to, provide services and protections for migrant workers. So I can put that up maybe on the chat. Voilà.
Thank you very much, Kenza. We have another more precise question here that somehow links up with the previous one. That's what's the recommended level of participation of tripartite and other social partners in the bilateral agreements?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really good question. And I also have to say that unfortunately, this is another case where the theory and the practice don't always completely coincide, in the sense that it is difficult to find real life good examples of social partner involvement in BLA development and implementation. But basically what ILO recommends is in the first phases, when a country is looking to enter into a BLA, ideally what is done is a sort of a preliminary assessment to understand more about the labor migration dynamics, the supply and demand dynamics, the rights issues that would need to be addressed. So in that preliminary assessment, that's really in the preparatory phase of a BLA, it is important to involve trade unions and employers organizations, because they are really the ones who understand the situation of workers and employers on the ground. So in that preparatory sort of assessment, it's important. In the drafting, so creating a drafting committee for a BLA or an MOU should be, ideally it's an interministerial committee, which can include, in a consultative role, CSOs, civil society organizations, trade unions and employers on the text. Usually in the negotiation itself, it's usually really government to government. I mean, nothing prevents social partners from being invited, but we have not seen any examples. So it's really in this preparatory and development phase. And in the monitoring phase, ensuring that during regular reviews, evaluations of BLAs and MOUs, that trade unions and employers are consulted. Have they seen any changes on the ground? Where do they see outstanding rights issues? Where do they see room for improvement? It's really important that they're involved in those monitoring and evaluation processes.
Okay, perfect. I think we can now move to the last question. That's a more general issue here. Many participants, they expressed somehow a little bit of skepticism in terms of how really useful are the bilateral agreements to the migrant workers. So, and I think possibly because we saw that in your slide about what's missing, and also you have expressed many times how much still has to be done. So I think maybe you could finish somehow with some optimistic words, telling people why, besides all the limitations, and why the bilateral agreements, they are still important, and how they in practical ways they impact the migrant lives at this stage.
Okay, thanks a lot, Fernando, for that last question. Yeah, sorry to be negative. It's true that there is a long way to go, but it is also true that BLAs are a little bit, in a sense, the best tool that we have for now to improve. Again, this idea of shared responsibility, which is really important. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One thing is that BLAs in themselves can sort of pave the way to new labor markets. Now, we've seen this in a lot of East African countries where by having a BLA between a country like Uganda or Ethiopia and an Arab state really opens the way for legal regular migration from their country to a formal employment in the country of destination that wasn't open before, there weren't regular channels for accessing that. So just that already really opening the way for regular migration is already and to a formal employment is already something quite an important achievement. The other thing, again, the level that the impact that it will have on migrant workers will really depend on to what extent there is implementation is taken seriously. So we see countries, again, I can take the Philippines as an example, which has invested in consular services. So meaning that if a worker is stranded or in difficulty or in a dispute, they can turn to a labor attaché in the consulate of the country of destination for assistance. Those type of consular services can be really, really important to just so that the migrant worker has a place to turn to. So that's another way that we can think, a very concrete way that the BLAs. Another thing is some countries have put in place services to verify contracts. So a standard employment contract will be signed prior to leaving the country of origin by the migrant worker. And then there will be a verification, often by the Ministry of Labor, either the Ministry of Labor or the destination country, but also with the consular services, on arrival will check to make sure that the contract is still the correct one and is being applied. So ensuring that a migrant worker's contract is really being respected and applied as was signed initially is very important, because there is often a practice what's called contract substitution, where a migrant worker can sign a contract and arrive in destination country and be told actually we're replacing it with a different one. So ensuring that there are controls on that kind of thing can be super important. Around the issue of keeping identity papers, that's also one I mentioned, the issue of confiscation of identity papers, ensuring that migrant workers are made aware that they have the right to hold on to their passports, to their visas, to their work permits, is something that can come out of BLAs. Again, requires follow-up to make sure that it's happening. But that's something that's really important to ensure a sort of more equal playing field for workers vis-a-vis their employers. So I guess I would just say that there's a lot to be done, but there's some innovative, interesting practices, again, particularly from Asia, probably because they've been at this for quite some time, particularly with the Arab states. There's also, a hope from the destination country side. I would just mention that, for instance, Qatar has asked for the help of the ILO to develop a model BLA, which is based on our conventions. So you see that some destination countries are also taking initiatives to ensure that they have, solid BLAs that respect the rights of migrant workers, which removes a bit of the burden for the origin country to negotiate what are sometimes tough terms. So there is some opening up. Qatar is also working on a standard employment contract for migrant workers, also with the help of the ILO. So I think it really does come down to implementation and monitoring. There's a lot that can be done, but it requires the resources and the political will. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kenza. Maybe we have some final announcements, and Miriam is going to take care of this part. But maybe Miriam has some last point to add to the discussion, or I don't know if you would like to anything that we haven't addressed here that would like to complement before we move to the announcements.
Fernando, do you hear me?
Yes.
Ok. Je vais parler en français, juste aussi pour...
All right, I'm going to speak in French, so just to change and have a little language balance, a little bit. So sorry, Fernando. What was the last question. Yes, just to check whether you wanted to add anything before the announcement, or something, some comments on your part, or some final considerations for our session.
Kenza, est-ce que par hasard tu veux
Kenza,
quelque chose que tu veux rajouter ou
would you like to add anything just to conclude?
Si c'est le cas, je t'en prie.
Kenza, would you like to add something
So if you
else?
want, you have
Please
the
feel free
floor.
to take the floor.
Otherwise,
Je vais de l'avant.
it's okay.
Okay.
All right, so we may switch to the final announcement before closing the session.
Alors, juste en fait, si je peux me permettre.
Right, so if I can, let me just go back to the final question you mentioned with Kenza, the fact that participants may not have a totally positive attitude towards BLAs, and because we saw the flaws existing, but that we may be close to the end of tribulations in this sense. So Piaciri, our former colleagues, were part of the reviewing session, and when he talked about the MOUs, he said something is better than nothing. And I don't know whether you agree with it, Kenza, but always remember that, of course, this may not be the magic bullet. There may also be many challenges, but they're there, and they are so helpful in the protection of migrant workers' rights. So may I insist on that something is better than nothing at all. And this is something to always keep in mind when speaking about BLAs or MOUs. So one last point, which is also interesting. So we haven't discussed about it during the session so much, at least. So the different and imbalances in the negotiation power between origin and destination countries. So it is undeniable that during negotiations of BLAs, the balance of power is on the part of the destination country. However, this should be an encouragement to strengthening the negotiation skills of the origin countries. So thanks, Kenza. I see we're running late. So your presentation was so clear, and as usual, the issue of BLA and MOUs is particularly appreciated by participants because it's really at the core of governance of labor migration and international cooperation concerning migration. Kenza, if you don't mind, I see that you have posted some links in the chat box. If ever you would like to share something with the participants, you can send me anything you want via email, and we will post it on the platform, because that's what we would like to do for all the participants. So don't worry, feel free to send me an email, and with any material you see could be very useful. So we're running very, very late, so let me close the session. So thanks, Kenza, of your time and your participation. Thanks, interpreters, to your flexibility, and helpfulness. So tomorrow we're going to be together again, and we're going to resume our sessions on skills recognition and qualification. So that will be the very first session tomorrow morning, followed by a second session on statistics. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for your time participation. So have a nice rest of the day. That could be evening, morning, or afternoon, according to where you are in the world. We will be here tomorrow, 8 a.m. Turin time, 9 a.m. Pretoria time. So thank you very much. And thanks, Fernando, for your facilitation. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.